So welcome all of you to this talk program we are having um, with Robin DJ Kelly. Robin is in the history department of UCLA, that's University of California at Los Angeles. And the occasion for this is really, of course, we are doing it on behalf of the Department of Political Science, University of Delhi, where I am a faculty there. So we, before the COVID days, before the lockdown. So the lockdown still works, Robin, for the universities, you know. So all the So in fact, a lot of people are jealous that all you teachers, you're just drawing salaries, sitting at home, you know. So I think there's some truth there, but that's the way it is. So we usually used to have these Wednesday afternoon seminars. And but still that same sense of time and space continues. So we still are having it on a Wednesday, even though it doesn't make sense now. We can even as well have it on a Sunday because nobody has to turn out into the and come to the campus. So it's part of that. We used to have this Wednesday seminars, and we didn't do it for a long time, you know, in the department. I think we went into some kind of a stasis, you know, some kind of a we didn't know like how to find our new groups again. So finally we did this. This is the first one since this session started that we are doing with you, Robin. So, and part of the reason was, of course, that why we went for Black Marxism was the big thing news about the Black Lives Matter movement, and it happened right at the when the campaign for the US presidential elections were beginning. So I think there was some kind of a worldwide, as they say, attention to it. So that was part of the reason. But I think that is only a kind of a subsidiary context, because when it comes to Black Marxism, I think it's always a good time to talk about it. You know, it's so crucial, it's so important. Now, I personally do not believe that there are different kinds of Marxisms, because, you know, you can have too long of a bad infinity kind of a series of different Marxisms. So Dalit Marxism, Black Marxism, Indian Marxism, Chinese Marxism. I think there's also something called Marxism. But yet, when it comes to Black Marxism, it seems like there is a kind of a deep connect which is assumed by even those who are critical of Marxism from within, say, the Black movement. So when I was looking at Cedric Robinson's amazing and classic text, Black Marxism, the Making of the Black Radical Tradition, I find that somewhere he, in that book, you'd of course know much better, Robin, where Robinson is, Cedric Robinson quotes Aimé Césaire to this effect, where I just got this written down here. I'll just read out. Maybe that will kind of also lay out the tone of today's session. So he quotes Aimé Césaire's declaration from 1956, and this is in Cedric Robinson's book, and it says, "What I demand of Marxism." This is Aimé Césaire being quoted by Cedric Robinson. It says, "What I demand of Marxism and communism is that they serve the Black peoples, not that the Black peoples serve Marxism and communism," right? So there's always a kind of a discontent with Marxism and communism. And here this expectation that Marxism and communism possibly can serve the Black peoples, you know, that kind of a hope, that looking in a way up to Marxism, this I find very interesting. So it says, what I demand of Marxism and communism is that they serve the Black peoples, not that the Black people serve Marxism and communism. Philosophies and movements must serve the people, not the people, the doctrine, and the movement. A doctrine is the value only if it is conceived by us and for us. And this is very crucial. They conceived by us and for us and revised through us. We consider it our duty to make common cause with all who cherish truth and justice in order to form organizations able to support effectively the Black peoples in their present and future struggle. So there is a dissatisfaction with Marxism, or let's say actually existing Marxism, actually existing communism, and yet there is also this bond that I see, a very deep internal connect with Marxism that and Cedric Robinson quotes this very approvingly, of what Caesar says. The other thing I want to just flag here before I invite Robin is something. I think Robin, this is from your introduction to the book, which was beautiful. It was so nice to read that. So thank you, Robin, for this amazing introduction that you've written. It says, and you say, Robin, in the introduction, and those who are joining late, this is from the introduction written by Robin D.J. Kelly to Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, the Making of a Black Radical Tradition. And I think in this title, Black Marxism, the title of the book, I think the subtitle is so important there, right? The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Yeah. So Robin writes, for these Black intellectuals and activists, he's talking about like a whole set of Black intellectuals and activists. Some, I think at one point, both you and Cedric Robinson call them as coming from a petty bourgeois background. So you say, for these Black intellectuals and activists, their dissatisfaction with socialist realism, now that's something very profound there. Their dissatisfaction with socialist realism had to do with the suppression of key elements of Black culture. That surrealism, right? Now we are going somewhere with this. Their dissatisfaction with socialist realism had to do with the suppression of key elements of Black culture. That surrealism, which started in, you can say, the 1920s and 30s, André Breton and Picasso, like maybe even Kandinsky, a whole lot of artists, including maybe the Soviet avant-garde, people like Dziga Vertov and Eisenstein, Vladimir Mayakovsky, the communist, the Bolshevik poet. A lot of them were also influenced by surrealism. So that's a very broad movement we're talking about. So had to do with the suppression of key elements of Black culture that surrealism embraced, the unconscious, the spirit, desire, magic, and love that most Black radicals did not jump headlong onto the surrealist bandwagon, ironically has to do with its similarity to the revolutionary core that was recognized as having always existed in African and Black diasporic life. Now that's so profound. That a lot of elements of surrealism, the unconscious, the spirit, the desire were already part of the African and Black diasporic life. And that's why a Black intellectual does not need to embrace surrealism to find these elements. He's finding it in his own culture, within Black life, within African, what should I say? Maybe tradition is not the right word, but something like that, right? So Cedric, so this is what I wanted to flag. The third thing I want to flag, and I hope people are joining in the meantime, is because this is on Marxism. I think some people might think, okay, we're talking about Marxism. Why are we talking about the unconscious or spirit and magic? So let me just bring this on Marxism itself. And this is from the other text, which I discovered very late. Robin, he has this text called Anthropology of Marxism. And it's such a shame that I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't know about it, but my knowledge is that in the Indian university departments, I never knew of this text, Anthropology of Marxism. And I've been reading it, and I find it amazing. Not that I agree with it, but it opens up so much there. So from Anthropology of Marxism, I'll just read this small quote. And again, it opens such a different register vis-a-vis Marx. And Cedric Robinson writes, by evacuating, again, you see, we We thought we got slightly derailed in the direction of surrealism. Now you will see something else again here. Another register opens here. He says, by evacuating radical medieval philosophy from socialism's genealogy. Now, usually radicals, Marxists, they don't think about medieval philosophy, and the fact that Robinson calls it radical. We are used to talking about the ancients, Plato, Aristotle, even in political science syllabuses here, you read Plato and Aristotle and, whatnot. But medieval, well, just say it's the Dark Ages and just get done with it. But here, Robinson opens up that register. So by evacuating radical medieval philosophy from socialism genealogy, Marx privileged his own ideological rules of discursive formation, providing a rationale for distinguishing a scientific socialism concomitant with the appearance of capitalist society from the lesser utopian and necessarily inadequate articulation of socialism which occurred earlier. So this entire thing that we learn in a kind of a textbook way, that the earlier socialism was utopian and hence lesser, but the later one, which Marx and Engels propounded, is scientific, hence better. So I think Robinson is questioning that, but he's questioning that not just as a critique of science or critique of scientism, but by actually saying, let's look at radical medieval philosophy, because there are a whole lot of people who will critique Marxism on so many grounds. But to critique Marxism and then say, but we need to look for a kind of a, not really an alternative, but to supplement maybe Marx in some ways, we have to also look at medieval socialist traditions. Now, very few people are going to say that, So doing, he deprived his own work, that is Marx. So doing, Marx deprived his own work of profound and critical insights. Notwithstanding their keen appetites for history, Marx and Engels had chosen to obliterate the most fertile discursive domain for their political ambitions and historical imaginations. Then what he says, possibly even less troubling for them, they displaced a socialist motivation grounded on the insistence that men and women were divine agents for the fractious and weaker allegiances of class. I hope we're all able to process this, absorb this. So he's one trying to ground socialism in this much broader, and you might say, today's radicals will say, oh, but that's a transcendental notion, that's trans-historical or ahistorical notion to talk about men and women as divine agents, right? So he's trying to say that Marx could have done better if he had tried to also take along these traditions of socialism that were there already in the medieval period, and that might mean that kind of rising above the very narrow, what you would think maybe something which is narrow, fractious, and weaker allegiances of class. And the usual thing here is that we do intersectional theory. We will say, okay, not just class, let's also bring in race, gender, and all of that, But Cedric Robinson's critique of Marxism, and that's what I find very interesting, Robin, is that his critique of Marxism comes from somewhere else, which is, I think, extremely important for us to consider. And maybe because we're also doing it in the Indian context here, I think it makes sense. And Robin, even for you, maybe it might be interesting to know that, say, even in India, we have this debate about the medieval period. We had a lot of traditions that talked about socialism. For example, Kabir is usually passed off as a mystic poet. I mean, Rabindranath Tagore actually has a I think that was in 1920s or something. He published this 100 songs of Kabir. And Tagore, being a Nobel laureate, whatever he writes gets disseminated the world over. So that was also one way through which Kabir was established as just a mystic poet, like Sufi, and and that gets absorbed into meditative practices and very contemplative practices and all of that. But if you look at Kabir and the entire tradition, including other saints, a lot of women saints, saints from lower caste backgrounds, like Sant Ravidas, Delhi is full of temples for Sant Ravidas. So the lower caste, the Dalit community, finds a lot of its spiritual and political energy from a lot of the saints from the medieval period, and so even in India we have this, this question that Cedric Robinson raises. So I flagged a few things here. I hope people have joined in. Ganesh, are we doing fine? People are joining in. There's no problem, right?
Looks like it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So what we'll do, Robin and I had earlier agreed to do a conversational thing, because I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on Robin to prepare separately for this lecture. So, and yet we agreed later that, Robin will start off with 15,
yes.
20 minutes, Robin?
Yeah, about 15, 20 minutes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, take your time.
Okay.
And then we'll open it up for a more conversational thing. So over to you, Robin.
Thank you so much, Saroj. That was amazing introduction and framing of a lot of things. And in fact, I just wanted to say a word about Anthropology of Marxism, because, just like it may be difficult to get that book in India, it's difficult to get it in the United States. I mean, most libraries did not have it. It was almost impossible. And at one point, before the University of North Carolina put out a new edition, the only way you can get it was people were selling it for like $200 for a little slim book. And it's just one of those things that just disappeared, like so much of Cedric's work. And one of the arguments he makes, as you know, is that he argues that there were socialist traditions that precede the development of capitalism. And so that the struggle, what we think of as a kind of almost inevitable struggle between, the bourgeoisie and feudalism, was also a struggle in terms of whether or not socialist traditions would move as a dominant form, not just the mode of production, certainly ideology. And so that's one of the reasons he wrote the book, was to sort of say that there's earlier traditions of socialism we have to pay attention to. And so what I want to do is just take about 15 minutes to give to put this book in some context, especially in light of what we saw over the spring of 2020, which is really a global insurgency against state violence, and it's still going on now, as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. And it's an insurgency that was in some ways shaped by Cedric's work. But let me just give you a little back. You know this, but some other people may not know. It was published originally in 1983 by a very obscure press called Zed Press. When it came out, got very few reviews, and then it kind of went out of print. When it came out in 83, I read it, and he became really the person who trained me, even though I'm a historian and he's a political scientist, political theorist. And so the book disappeared, and then I contacted a publisher and said, you need to reproduce this book. You need to put a new edition. So that's how the 2000 edition came out, the one that you have with my foreword. And then suddenly people began to read it. Not a lot, slowly began to build some momentum. And by the way, I should say there's another edition about to come out in, I think, March or April. And I have a newer introduction to it, which situates in the 2020 rebellion. So that's it. So the two pillars that emerged out of that book that shaped some of the political organizing on the ground here in the United States are racial capitalism and the Black radical tradition. And these are the two pillars. And in fact, since Cedric's death in 2016, there has been like a cottage industry around writing about racial capitalism. Some of the stuff is really bad, I'm not gonna lie. And some of it's pretty interesting. And so what I wanna do is very quickly lay out some of the debates around racial capitalism that are affecting political organizing today, and then lay out a couple of debates around Black radical tradition, and then just open up for a conversation. So by racial capitalism, and by the way, almost all the organizations I'm associated with, like the Movement for Black Lives, use the language of racial capitalism. I mean, they've adopted it and embraced it. And there's far more left than, say, the kind of petty bourgeois organizations from 40 years ago. So what is racial capitalism? So Ruth Wilson Gilmore says capitalism is never not racial. And what she means by that, and what Cedric meant by that, was that capitalism emerged within a civilization that was already built on a kind of racial hierarchy. And from its inception, what capitalism does is it extracts surplus value, and it structures exchange value by assigning differential value to human life and labor. So through things like land enclosure, what Marx would have called primitive accumulation, land enclosure, slavery, land dispossession, displacement, predatory lending, taxation, disfranchisement, the long history of looting. And I know looting is a word that comes that refers to the British looting of India. But looting through terror and government policies that suppressed Black and brown and indigenous people, their wages, they relieved us of property, excluded Black and brown people from better schools and public accommodation. This is racial capitalism. Now, what's interesting is that this is ongoing debate now among US Marxists and social democrats who not only reject the idea that racial and capitalism could go together, they do such a thing as racial capitalism, but they've also dismissed as insufficiently anti-capitalist the current rebellion against state violence. So in fact, when I say current, not just to 2020, really, we're talking about going back to at least 2012, to be honest, going back the whole 20th century. Actually, to be honest, to go back to the beginning of this country, but it's really kind of emerged recently. So you have that. And so they've argued that these movements against police violence are not sufficiently anti-capitalist, and that even the struggles against political disfranchisement, the struggles against deportation, the struggle against pipeline expansion, the struggle right now among fast food workers fighting for $15 an hour, service workers, that all these struggles are not sufficiently anti-capitalist. And so they argue that racism is simply not constitutive of capitalism, but operates alongside capitalism. And so in other words, the way they see race in racism is as an irritant rather than constitutive. So to oppress, the idea is the irritant kind of, oppresses certain subgroups and therefore divide the working class. And in fact, the Marxist geographer David Harvey was questioned a couple of years ago for sidelining or for not really paying attention to race and for failing to see how, like, many of the mass uprisings against state violence in the United States were in fact anti-capitalist. And Harvey's reply was, race was simply not part of the logic of capital accumulation. He said, there's nothing inherently anti-capitalist about anti-racism. And he wrote, I don't see the current struggles in Ferguson as dealing very much in anti-capitalism. Now, Ferguson was the center of a rebellion centered around the killing of a teenager named Mike Brown. And I'm gonna say a little bit about that in a second, but that's what that refers to. And then there was an essay that came out just 6 months after Cedric died by Walter Ben Michaels, who's another Marxist. And he declares, and I just want to read this quote to you because it's very, very important. He says, it's not racism that creates the difference between classes, it's capitalism. And it's not anti-racism that can combat the difference, it's socialism. You don't build the left by figuring out which victim has been most victimized. You build it by organizing all the victims. When it comes to the value of universal health care, for example, we do not need to worry for a second about whether the Black descendants of slaves are worse off than the white descendants of coal miners. The goal is not to make sure that Black people are no sicker than white people. It is to make everyone healthy. Now, when you read that, first response is, yeah, well, that makes sense. Yes, you know, a Marxist, yes, universal. But I just want to be clear about stuff. To insist that capitalism has always operated within a system and ideology that assigns differential value to human life and labor does not mean that, say, hiring, say, Black police officers or incorporating the Black elite into existing power structures will like speed up the demise of racial capitalism or bring us closer to a kind of colorblind capitalism. What Cedric was saying was, like Cedric never subscribed to the idea that the movements that find inspiration in his work, you know, kind of believe this notion that that somehow to say race is to avoid what the real issues are. So Walzer, Michael Walzer, Walterman Michaels, David Harvey, and others, they end up not only attacking a kind of straw man, but failing to grasp how the logics of racism fundamentally shape capital accumulation and the role of the state. They just miss it. So to go back to the example of Michael Brown, so Michael Brown's killed in St. Louis County. And this is a place called Ferguson, it's a suburb of St. Louis in Missouri. And when people took to the streets, they weren't just fighting for justice for Mike Brown, they were protesting a predatory system of policing that used fees and fines and arrest warrants and tickets to extract millions of dollars from mostly poor Black over-policed communities while extending generous tax breaks to corporations and stripping public schools of essential services and needed revenue. In other words, asset stripping. And that's what they're out there fighting for. So if that's not anti-capitalist, I'm not sure what is. And especially fighting a police force whose role is to protect capital and property. So we also know that, you know, universal health care, which is a fundamental longstanding demand of the Black freedom movement, will not like magically abolish the conditions that produce the kind of health inequities that are along racial lines, nor will it guarantee a kind of equal bias-free treatment for patients. Just on a descriptive level, we can see that capitalism does not operate from a purely colorblind market logic, but through the ideology of white supremacy. And if you just think about like the way COVID is operating here in the United States, it's not an accident that Black, brown, indigenous people are the hardest hit. And it's not because we're more susceptible to COVID, it just has to do with who has access to fair and decent medical care. You know, and even within a universal medical care system, you still have segregation and inequalities in access. And there's always ways to buy yourself better care. And there's other things which I won't need to talk about, but the main things that Cedric revealed exactly how racial capitalism actually creates difference between classes. You know, when you look at like environmental and health hazards, for example, how policies produce scarcity, poverty, illegal economies, these kinds of things. And he also shows in his book why anti-racism is fundamental to combat difference. So he begins, or he began by dismissing the myth that capitalism was this great modernizer giving birth to the proletariat, to like a universal class. And instead he wrote, quote, "The dialectic of proletarianization disciplined the working classes to the importance of distinctions between ethnics and nationalities, between skilled and unskilled workers, and between races. The persistence and creation of such oppositions within the working classes were a critical aspect of the triumph of capitalism in the 19th century." And he gives examples within Europe itself of the Irish, how the Irish were products of a very different set of popular traditions born and bred under colonialism. And then the English working class was formed by Anglo-Saxon kind of chauvinism, racial ideology that was shared across class lines, that the English bourgeoisie and the working class often shared. Okay, the last thing is just to talk about the Black radical tradition and what does he mean by that? Oh, yes, okay. So Robinson, takes Marx and Engels to task, as you mentioned before, on another number of issues, for underestimating the material force of racial ideology on proletarian consciousness. So in his preface to the 2000 edition of Black Marxism, Cedric writes, Marxism's internationalism was not global. Its materialism was exposed as an insufficient explanator of cultural and social forces, and its economic determinism too often politically compromised freedom struggles beyond or outside the metropole. And so it's this observation that a lot of people counter by pointing to Marx's writings, say, on India, or his writings on the United States or Russia, his writings on slavery and colonialism and imperialism and peasants. And others argue that Marx himself never claimed to be doing anything beyond understanding capitalist development in Western Europe. And I could agree with that, but because neither Marx nor Engels considered the colonies and their plantations central to modern capitalist processes. In other words, what happens in India, what happens in Haiti, what happens in what we think of as now the third world or global South, that these were the centers of modern capitalist processes, not the periphery. But because of that, class struggles, for example, within a slave regime or peasant rebellions within a colonial order were kind of ignored or dismissed as underdeveloped or peripheral. So Cedric's point was that Marx and Engels missed the significance of revolt in the rest of the world, specifically by non-Western peoples who made up the majority, the vast majority of the world's unfree and non-industrial labor force. In other words, it's the unfree labor in Africa, the Americas, Asia, that really was producing the lion's share of surplus value for the world system. But the ideological source of those revolts as they emerged was not necessarily like capitalism or the mode of production. It had to do with the cultures out of which they sprang. And so when you talked about, when you quoted Aimé Césaire and talked about Cedric's focus on, divine, what he's saying is that the ideological source of these revolts happen to be the societies with radically different beliefs, different cosmologies, different metaphysics, different intellectual traditions, a different sense of morality, and not necessarily locked in Western Europe. And so from this observation, Robinson then unveils what is basically the secret history of the Black radical tradition, which he describes as a revolutionary consciousness that proceeded from the whole historical experience of Black people. And this could be applied to other peoples. The Black radical tradition defies racial capitalism's efforts to remake African social life and generate new categories of human experience, stripped bare of the kind of historical consciousness embedded in the cultures from which they came. And we could talk about what that means. And I'm gonna skip over that. I just want to make one last point. When I talked about the sort of petty bourgeoisie or the native bourgeoisie, and just to emphasize that the last section of the book where he talks about W.B. Du Bois, Hilaire James, and Richard Wright and others, he's kind of making an argument that the incorporation of the native bourgeoisie into the structures of colonialism and capitalism positioned Black intellectuals in a unique place where on the one hand, they were within the political, educational, and bureaucratic structures of the dominant racial and colonial order. And they gave them access to information and ideas and thoughts. But they also were contradictory in that they were descendants of enslaved and colonized people. They were victims of racial domination and tools of empire. And that put them in a unique position to be able to both critique the system and be a part of it. And that's why he ends up looking at these intellectuals. And part of his argument is that these radical intellectuals are not the Black radical tradition. They discover it. They're shaped by it. They inherit it. And that's a really important thing. They divine the theory of Black radicalism. And so in the final section of the book, which is always a source of confusion here in the United States, especially among some of the Black readers I have, is that Black Marxism, and you hinted at this in your points, it's not a book about Black Marxists or about the ways in which Black intellectuals improved Marxism by attending to race. Fundamentally, I mean, because when we think of it this way, people begin to ask the question, well, how come he didn't do it Frantz Fanon? How come he didn't do it Claudia Jones? Where's Walter Rodney? And et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, as he says, you know, it was never my purpose to exhaust the subject, only to suggest that it was there. But most importantly, it was never meant to be a list, like a list of radical intellectuals. Rather, it was really a study of the way in which their praxis, through praxis, they discovered that tradition, they were overtaken by it, and that Marxism was the critical path to discovery. So it wasn't that he's jettisoning Marxism, it's through that critical path of discovery that you recognize the limits of it. But, you know, if Marx were born in like 1919 and writing today, he wouldn't be doing a study of England. I mean, it would be a different situation, you know? So that's I think the main thing. So I'm gonna stop there, just say one last sentence, which is, you know, Black Marxism, you know, itself is it's not anti-Marxist, nor can we argue that it is sort of, you know, traditionally Marxist, but rather I think of the book as a dialectical critique of Marxism that is still rooted in materialism, but a materialism that's more expansive, that talks about the material force of ideas, and ideas extend beyond rational logic to the world of the irrational, or in some ways the world of the religious, or the world of the spiritual. And that in some ways it's this critique of the long history of Black revolt, and to Black radical intellectuals who, in confronting fascism, colonialism, and the prospect of socialism, also turn to the history of Black revolt to construct a wholly original theory of revolution and interpretation of the history of the modern world. So that, in a nutshell, is what the book is for me. And I'd love to just then have a conversation about anything you want to talk about.
Thank you. Thank you, Seth, Robin. Thank you, Robin, for this this exposition, your presentation. You know, then we thought we'll do a more conversational thing. I would just like you to highlight a bit more on the influence of Haiti on Cedric Robinson. Also because when I was making this course for Delhi University on Black radical tradition, I had the sense that somehow, say in India, and maybe it's the same with the academia or even activist circles in the US, including Black activist circles, you know, we tend to take, I think mostly the 20th century radicals, or even if we take the older slave revolts and all of that, somehow it begins with Toussaint and Dessalines.
Dessalines,
but when I did, but when I did my little study on my own, sitting here, I found that before Toussaint and Dessalines, there is Macandal.
Yes.
And there's Bookman.
Right.
I don't know how you pronounce it, you know, Bookman.
Yeah, Bookman.
Okay, Bookman, yeah. So, and then at that time I was reading C.L.R. James' Black Jacobins. And, you know, my interest in what happened before Toussaint, or what led up to Toussaint and Dessalines, that got accentuated after reading C.L.R. James. And when I looked at the other literature, to me, it looks like there are two different kind of registers there, where from Tussaud and Dessalines you can directly come to, I mean, there's some kind of a use of Enlightenment radicalism, or something, say the radicalism coming out of the French Revolution that Tussaud and even Dessalines is mobilizing to a large extent, you know. Whereas when I looked at Bookman and McCandless, they seem to be pointing somewhere else. And then Robin, when I came to Robinson's book, Cedric Robinson's, and I was so happy to find that he's talking about the Maroons there, you know. And the way what he does with the Maroons in this book is amazing, because he is very critical of a lot of scholars, the way they have talked about the Maroons, even in the context of Black slave revolts. And to me, it looks like Cedric Robinson is trying to give its proper place, you know, give a proper place to the tradition coming out of McCandless and Bookman. And the fact that he goes to the Maroons displaces what goes on in the name of Black radicalism, and not just Black Marxism, you know. Black Marxism is still a distant cry, even with Black radicalism. So when I designed this course, I thought we have to bring that tradition here, and I was not finding the right, theorist to help me out in this. So, and then I discovered Cedric Robinson, you know.
Right.
So it'll be nice if you can tell us a little bit more about how Robinson also, you know, engaged with Haiti, and even in your own work, you know.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. Well, one thing, you know, for Robinson, Maroons were central. The acts of marronage, that is escape and trying to reproduce the native life you left behind, and reproduce forms of democratic and social practice, that's marronage. Now, he says this is really the heart and soul, the driver of what he sees as Black radical tradition. And why does he talk about that? Partly because, you know, there's a presumption that all revolutions are supposed to look like France. And this is his critique of C.L.R. James, is that although C.L.R. James does recognize briefly McCandless, does talk about Bookman and his uprising in 1791 and how important that was, what Cedric argues is that James reads Toussaint and Dessalines through the lens of Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. That the 3-volume History of the Russian Revolution becomes so in some ways there's Dessalines as Stalin and Toussaint is Lenin. And that's how he sees it, you know? And so, of course, when you see it that way, and it's true that Toussaint himself was a Republican. I mean, he loved the French Revolution, but he could not have won that war had it not been for the Maroons actually in Saint-Domingue in Haiti, who many of them had come from the Congo and actually brought with them knowledge of warfare. That's how they were able to defeat the Spanish, the French, the British, and the French again, you know, because of the knowledge of warfare. It wasn't just Toussaint's genius. It had to do with culture. And so Cedric's thing was always, you know, we've got to be able to have a radical critique and understanding of history that actually attends to culture and consciousness. So when he says, you know, it's one thing to say that the slaves resisted, we know that, but what kind of people were they? Like, what kind of people were they? How do we understand them? And so Haiti is really important because, of course, Haiti was the first country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. It wasn't the United States. It wasn't, you know, it was Haiti. And it was, and it represented for so many a model of what a revolution could be. The problem with Haiti, though, is that once 1804 comes, they stop talking about it. Because at that point, it falls into like civil war. There's a continued embargo on the United States on Haiti. And then also the French ultimately keep waging a kind of material and economic war to try to get reparations, as if somehow France was the one that lost when slaves were free, as if they had to pay some indemnity. And
that's when Napoleon is already there, right? In
yes,
France.
Napoleon is in France. And then and the indemnity, in fact, they end up paying like several times. They pay in the late 19th century. They end up paying. They pay in 1825, then they pay another, then they go into debt. They have to borrow money. So what they have to do is borrow money from French banks to pay them back. So they're paying back interest. So the idea of structural adjustment and the debt crisis really begins with Haiti. And then when the United States, and Cedric writes about this too, when the US, not in Black Marxism, but in another book, when the US invades Haiti in 1914 and occupies it until 1934, one of the things they do is they go into the banks and they seize 40% of the assets to pay back US banks and French banks. I mean, it's just straight theft.
That's right.
You know? And so Haiti on the one hand, because it's this triumphant revolution, the tragic dimensions of it and the way it plays into the ongoing, settler colonialism and capitalism ends up sort of disappearing. And yet, at the same time, it really becomes a model for understanding the essence of the Black radical tradition.
Do you also use some of the experience from Haiti in your own work, Robin?
Oh yes, I mean I teach a bunch of courses, and one course I teach is a history of African Americans from up to 1870s, up to 1898, basically. And so we spend at least a week just talking about, lecturing on the Haitian Revolution, and and there's several ways to think about it. To think about the history of the revolution, think about the contestation over that history. So they read James, they will read other more contemporary authors on Haiti. But then one of the ways that Haiti plays a role is in shaping European thought. So there's a book by a woman named Susan Buck Morris. She's not the first one to make this argument, but there was there's a Haitian scholarship around this before Susan came along, which shows that Hegel was spending all this time reading newspapers about Haitian Revolution.
Hegel was following the news from Haiti
exactly.
at the time.
And he followed that news, and that's and so phenomenology of spirit, I guess, where he talks about the master slave dialectic, that all comes from his reading and understanding of Haiti. So Haiti is a really important world historical event, and the other place of contestation is the disbelief that historian Michel Wolf-Triot writes about this, the kind of the disbelief on the part of Europeans that Haiti could even exist as a sovereign nation. Like, no one was willing to believe that they were defeated by Toussaint's armies or Dessalines' armies, So there's that story, that is the unknowability, the impossibility of Haiti. But then this final thing, which I talk about, but a lot of people don't talk about, and this has to do with the betrayal of the Black elites, including Dessalines. That Dessalines is considered heroic, but after 1804, Dessalines, in order to continue, first Toussaint did this, then Dessalines, in order to maintain levels of agricultural production, some for export, they stopped allowing kind of small peasant holdings and went back to the kind of labor associated with slavery. And Dessalines at one point owned 33 plantations. So Dessalines. This is after the revolution. And slavery is abolished, but but slavery doesn't exist, but there are forms of forced labor, corvée labor, forms of gang labor to produce for export, because that's how.
This is, we are talking about what, 1820s or something we're talking about?
Well, now we're talking about, in case of Dessalines, like 1805, 6, 1807, 1810, like immediately after the revolution. Christophe, same thing. Christophe, another revolutionary, owned a lot of plantations. So there was still wealth inequality and wealth accumulation. So Haiti, which gives us a really important lesson about class struggle. That's right. You know, you can have that national liberation, you can eliminate slavery, but forms of extractive, exploitative labor, the proletarianization of the rural areas in an economy that is being bombarded and encircled, that's being destroyed by the United States, is very important part of the story.
So we have the kind of the, you know, major historical slave rebellion in Haiti, but then we also have maybe the first shapes of a, not really a black bourgeoisie, but something like that, a black ruling class. I had seen some pictures of some palace they built, you know, in Haiti. There's some story around it, some huge palace, and one of the leaders of the Black Rebellion later, he declares himself king or something, you know, some emperor. Christophe. Okay.
Christophe, exactly. I mean, you know, it's amazing. The leadership, the political class in Haiti throughout the 19th century either does one or two things. They become dictators, or they try to be liberal Democrats, but for whom? For France. So there's an ongoing neo-colonial relationship. So some of the people considered more liberals are the ones who made deals with the French to basically allow Haiti to pay back indemnities, which they should have never paid back. I mean, technically, if anything, France owes Haiti reparations, but that's another story. And it's just, it's quite a tragedy. And yet, one thing that hasn't been lost, and this is important, is the Black radical tradition is still there in Haiti. You know, it's still there. People still fight back, people still struggling. And we know they're struggling because that's why every regime in Haiti required a secret police, a violent army, forms of state violence that will allow the suppression of rebellious forces within Haiti.
I was looking at this maybe ethnographic work by on Haiti, on the carnival and the voodoo in Haiti by a Black woman called Neil Hurston.
Oh, Zora.
Is that
Zora Neale?
Zora Neale Hurston. And I was, I really liked that work, you know, and it really took me into a lot of ethnographic detail. How do you rate her work? How does Cedric ever refer to that, or do you use her work?
Yeah. I mean, Zora Neale Hurston was both a great anthropologist, but also herself a really colorful historical character. As a novelist, she wrote the book "Their Eyes Were Watching God," which is her famous novel. But she did the work in Haiti. She did ethnographic work there, and just like she did ethnographic work in the U.S. South, and that work is still considered pioneering. She was willing to deal with zombies, you know, voodoo, with forms of folk knowledge and folk magic in Haiti. And she was there at a crucial time in the 1930s. So when she was doing that field work, the U.S. occupation had just ended.
Okay.
I think it just ended because it ended in 1934. And so, yeah, she was a very interesting, brilliant person whose work on Haiti actually is not as famous as her work on the United States.
Because when I was reading Cedric Robinson's work, I thought, okay, you know, this looks like a book which eventually will have references to her work. And then I kept looking, you know, and I want to engage with you one last point, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the participants for question and answer and for comments. So please don't go away. I'll just take 1 extra minute. Robin, in your introduction to the book, you write, for the Africans whom Robinson identified as the progenitors of this tradition in the New World, he insists that the focus of their revolt And then you quote Robinson here. He insists that the focus of the revolt was always on the structures of the mind. Mm-hmm. Its epistemology granted supremacy to metaphysics, not the material. So the focus of the Black Revolt was on the structures of the mind. Its epistemology granted supremacy to metaphysics, not the material. Right. I'm not saying I disagree with this. I think there's no direct connection that the moment you talk about metaphysics and the mind, you move away from Marxism. I don't have such a crude understanding of Marxism. I think Marxism can also engage with metaphysics and the mind. So I'm not really pointing in that direction. But yet, what did Robinson really mean when he talked about the mind and talking about metaphysics in the context of the Black radical tradition?
Right. That's an excellent question. It's a really important question, in fact, and this is where the issue of essentialism comes in. He's been accused of it. And part of what he's trying to get at was that he and this is where Marronage comes in as well. So he drew on the evidence he had available to him really at the time about how Africans responded to the Middle Passage. And that the Middle Passage, of course, is the moment from capture to being forced into barracoons or like on shores or in slave castles, not castles, but really prisons, onto the ship into the New World and what that meant. And so that journey from Middle Passage to plantation life to revolts to marronage. And so what he drew on was from the evidence, what he got from the evidence was actions and thoughts as ways of being that don't correspond to Western rationalism. In other words, we can, if we operate from a kind of purely materialist perspective, then we can probably guess how people will respond based on, say, mode of repression, based on, but he's saying that they're not thinking in those ways, that the ideas and practices that place the collective we above the I, as well as the kind of assumptions that political theorists often make about authority and leadership. And this ties back to his first book, The Terms of Order, which we could talk about. But so what he observed in looking at the movement through Middle Passage to plantation to revolt to marronage was a shared epistemology among this diverse group of African people. And so this is where, he's saying essentially that what we think of as metaphysics has a material foundation.
Exactly,
but it's just simply not the foundation that is grounded in what we think of as simply the mode of production. In other words, it's not the exploitation as a slave, but it's being African. And so like, he'll talk about, say, among the Tonga people, that they embrace the principle that all are equally incomplete, that they require each other in all of life itself, that land, animals, plants, to become complete. That's metaphysics. The result is a kind of metaphysics of relatedness of things, of the indivisibility of life. And so for Robinson, he suggests that this kind of metaphysics, and he actually says it's not alien to Western life either. He's saying that these forms of metaphysics, they flash up on occasion. And we could, some anarchists write about this, like Peter Kropotkin, for example, about mutual aid. But the main thing is that he's saying that, that the metaphysics is, we have to pay attention to that, and to ontology, that is being, that is, that what he calls a kind of ontological wholeness. That is this sense that you are incomplete unless you're unless you're connected to. And that sense of alienation is not about the alienation of the product that you produce or the commodity, but the alienation from other peoples, Africans. And so it's kind of, I think it's always ironic that a lot of intellectuals speak like so confidently about the Western tradition. and they teach millions of students about the tradition as if it's a kind of a thing, you know, and you know, as if somehow these same aspects of metaphysics don't actually shape the construction of Western ideology. And so that the construction of a Western tradition, you know, also obscures thought within Europe that's deemed heretical. So part of what he's dealing with is all the heretical moments, the antinomian movements in Europe, they're not considered Western tradition. You know, the levelers and diggers, they're not considered Western tradition because they have a different way of thinking, a different kind of metaphysics of relatedness of things. And so what we end up doing is that what stands in for Western tradition is really a kind of epistemocentrism. That is that a certain kind of epistemology is the dominant one and everything else you got to shut up. And so that's where I would argue that what he's saying is extremely important for Marx's understanding of revolt and of consciousness. Maybe not of the operations of capitalism, but certainly in trying to understand what, the idea that what is it that's the motive behind revolt, behind opposition, behind resistance. And if we don't pay attention to the metaphysics, we end up missing what matters to people. And sometimes what matters to people isn't simply just food on the table. If that makes sense. That was a long answer, but these are the things that
that's fine.
Think about.
Thank you, Robin. Now let's open up the house, or maybe the online. I don't know how to address these things. Okay, let's open up the house for comments and questions from others. So please, come in. Whoever wants to make a point here, ask a question.
Yeah, don't jump all at once.
Yeah, Ganesh, are you here with us? I can't see any of you. I think I have to slide this.
Yes, sir. I think people have not known us turn the video on. Maybe that is why.
Okay.
Yeah, everyone has a video off except you and me.
Yeah, it's embarrassing, Don't embarrass us like this.
I know people exist.
Yeah.
And I'm also open to talk about anything, including.
Well, that's Ganesh. We finally get to see Ganesh.
Oh, hey, how you doing? I know people want to talk about the elections too.
Yeah, please. Yeah,
yes.
Elections, Black Lives Matter, Trump.
Yes. Yeah, I have a different take on some of these things.
You can open it up.
Yeah.
I was thinking I could ask you two questions.
Sure.
One is that it's about this new book by Isabel Wilkerson.
Oh, by who?
On caste. By Isabel Wilkerson on caste.
Oh God, yes. Okay.
Yes, and that book has seems to be written for
Ganesh,
this.
your voice is echoing a little bit.
It's just.
Am I audible now? It seems to be written for this mass reading, liberal reading in US. But I think it's written as a guide to race and racial brutality in US through an allegory of caste.
Yeah.
But basically, it seems to be a pedagogical experiment at an universal theorization of exploitation and suffering. And I was thinking that apart from the contents of the book or the details, I was just thinking on this broad idea of a universal theorization of exploitation and suffering, and how it sits along with, say, Cesar's comment that a doctrine is of value only if it is conceived by us, for us, and revised through us. And how do we look at these two approaches of looking at human suffering?
Okay. That's a really good question. And I have to sort of put my biases out there. I detest that book. I think it's one of the worst books that's ever been written in the last 20 years. And, and let me tell you why. I mean, she didn't do the work. And, you know, she clearly didn't really study either the caste system, as she acts like the caste, and put it in quotes, as if caste in India is unchanging for 4,000 years. You know, so, and then she uses that as a way, not, it's, see, your reading of it was really generous. I mean, that was really, you're really sort of, I think, nice in seeing it as a kind of theorization, but what she's trying to do is really displace any discussion of race, and she replaces it with caste as if it's a new discovery. But her understanding of caste is not based on, it's sort of based on a kind of slim reading of India, but it's also based on about American sociologists and anthropologists in the 1930s and 40s who resurrected caste to understand race. And so and then displaced the work of Oliver Cox, who was a Marxist sociologist. And she actually dismisses him. She just says he's cantankerous and doesn't really deal with him. But what the book does do is it sets back the study of race and racism like 70 years. And when you read it, it's full of all these metaphors that, it's both two things, it's metaphors and suffering. So the metaphors stand in for analysis. So you've got like metaphors about houses and foundations and roofs and sills and all this stuff. And she says, caste is the bones, race is the skin. You know, this is the kind of, and then she so it's metaphors, and then the suffering is almost like gratuitous. So she writes these long passages that describe things that are already pretty well known, and then says it's caste. So in other words, she just simply changes the name. So there's nothing depth, but here's the problem, and this is where it becomes relevant for our discussion. Her conclusion, or her focus and conclusion, is really about the Black elite. It's not about the Black working class. It's certainly not about the white working class. It's basically saying that these caste categories in the United States are fixed. And by being fixed, they really can't be changed except through a change of heart on the part of white people. So when white people are able to see us and break from their caste, then we can change the system. And presumably, you know, this is the story of India, and this is the story of Germany, because Germany's the other place. So, I mean, I don't have to tell you how ridiculous that idea is, but so many of the stories she tells are about her in a very expensive restaurant not being served. Why? Because of caste. Her in first class, getting on a plane, and the flight attendant's not helping her, and it's because of caste. Now, she never stops to kind of be self-conscious of the fact that maybe there's class struggle going on the plane. Maybe the flight attendant may be racist and, you know, is forced to have to serve these people who think they need to be served. But all that's what it is. The one last thing I'll say about the book is that she completely sidesteps colonialism. So she tells the story of India as if the British Raj had nothing to do with the formation and reshaping of forms of domination within India. She says, oh, India is comparable to the United States because they both were ruled by the British at one point. And that's it. That's the extent of colonialism. And finally, I'm sorry to go on a rampage about this, but imagine you decide then Germany, where the objective is to make a caste of Jews, but elimination was genocide. So she says, well, here's another example of the caste system, and never once mentioned the fact that Germany formed much of the violent structure of domination, the violent structure of fascism was formed in its colonies in Southwest Africa, in Cameroons, this is what M.A. Cedric talks about. And this is what, to bring back to Cedric, she writes a book as if, you know, capitalism is actually the normative in the way it should be. We just need a colorblind capitalism so that the elite won't be treated badly by working class white people. That is the takeaway from the book. You know? So I'm sad to say it that way, but it's true, you know. And there will be more reviews, critical reviews. And there've been very good reviews, mostly by Indian scholars have been more critical, but some of the Black scholars won't touch it because it's all about people worrying about their careers. I mean, they took in New York City, there was a full billboard promoting that book. I mean, who makes billboards for books, you know? So, I mean, that's basically it. So it doesn't quite answer the question, but it does explain the uselessness of analogies when you actually don't really know what you're talking about. So.
That's quite something.
Don't buy that book. Okay. Anyone else? Thoughts?
I have a question in the chat window from Shivesh. Do you want to read the question or shall I read it out?
Yeah, let me look here. It's in the chat. Yes, I'll read it. Let's see. Okay, so which one is it? Is it from?
Okay, Shivesh has a comment and a question.
Okay.
His comment is that religion is the order of social system. Populist leaders across the world are smart enough to push this tension further in some way or the other way. Left's version of populist tactics, if there will be any, must pass through the vital identity questions of race, caste, and sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And his question, thank you, Professor Kelly, for the provocative arguments related to the nuances of Black Marxism. Wanted to ask you a question regarding the probable future contribution of Black Marxism towards the populist upsurge of the right in American society in particular, or world in general. Ernesto Lacau and Chantal in their collaborative project, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, try to develop something related to left populism. Do you see any such counter from the Black Marxism towards the development of left populism, about which Moff and Lacau were talking about through their theory of chain of equivalence?
Okay, that's a really good question. Part of it's interesting because part of the social democrats and some of the Marxists that I critiqued for their kind of critique of, well, I shouldn't say critique of Black Marxism because they hadn't really read it, but the critique of the arguments coming out of Black Marxism does draw on the notion of a left populism. And you know, it's interesting. The left populism argument is very seductive, but it also depends. By populism, often, like you were saying in the comment about the way populist leaders across the world can actually draw on ideologies, religious ideologies, often ideologies about race, to generate mass movements, to mobilize mass movements. And the left populism is going to be the answer to that. And, you know, in some ways, Black Marxism does counter the simple argument for left populism. It's not saying that mass movements or mass mobilizations or interracial, multiracial movements are not possible. It doesn't say that. In fact, it encourages, pushes forward. But it argues that if you think of an undifferentiated proletariat, or an undifferentiated sort of dispossessed class, then you may not be able to build the kind of mobilization without suppressing difference. Difference actually doesn't have to be a limit. Difference could be like a driver. And I'll give you a really concrete example. 26 million people came out into the streets after the murder of George Floyd. And those people were multiracial, came across the board. And, you know, we saw them, I mean, I was in the streets with them. And what's interesting is that they were not out there calling for some kind of false universalism. They weren't saying, you know, we want an end to X because we all benefit. They were taking a different tack, and that is solidarity that's based not on empathy, but based on identification with other kinds of struggles that may not be yours. Left populism assumes a kind of recognition that there are certain universal struggles and claims that could draw us all in. But here are people saying, I'm going to be arrested because I don't want any Black people being killed, and they're not Black. That has been, in many ways, the radical tradition, not just the Black radical tradition, but the radical tradition even within the Western world. I mean, you think about, I mean, even something like the Russian Revolution, which we forget, not all of us forget. In the United States, they don't know this, but the Russian Revolution was a mass rebellion. It wasn't just the Bolshevik seizure of power. It was Petrograd, millions of people in the streets. And a lot of people came out, not just because they wanted bread and they were hungry, or a lot of them came out for each other, you know, and they came out for each other, even if there's not a direct benefit. So imagine what it meant for men to actually support women's rights in Russia, you know, in 1916, 17, you know, that was a kind of significant moment. So there's possibilities of mass rebellion and opposition that may take a different valence around solidarity and you know, internationalism, you know. And so that's, I guess, the way I see it. And the Black Marxism does, at least Cedric, I could talk about Cedric because someone I knew, would basically endorse this idea of solidarity. And you know, after he finished Black Marxism, he spent a lot of time doing media work around, he had a show called Third World News. And Third World News was all about reporting about, you know, crises and revolutions all over the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America. And that was a call to movements in the United States to stand up in solidarity for other struggles, whether it's, you know, in Iran or Nicaragua, you know, and, you know, so that was really, I think, what he meant and what we're seeing in these movements. But in the United States, they're not lasting though, because as soon as you get people out in the streets, there's another wing that says, oh, we need to only mobilize around universal demands. So so police violence is not a winner for us. What's a winner is universal healthcare. And then suddenly all that discourse, all the discussion, all the recognition of the way in which capitalism differentially produces oppressions and inequalities, and that the white work class doesn't benefit from it. It is affected differently. That gets pushed out the window for some kind of universalism, which then narrows the scope of mobilization. If that makes sense.
That reminds me of Bernie Sanders there when you talk about universal healthcare. Yes. Was that a problem with Bernie Sanders' agenda?
Well, Sanders, Bernie Sanders got much better on this. So see, the thing is, it's not, and you know this, but it's not an either or. It's like all these movements are demanding universal healthcare and single payer healthcare. All these movements are demanding, the end of student debt, the end of debt altogether. They're fighting for the end of austerity, all these things, and they're fighting to end state police violence and racial profiling and things like that. So Bernie has gotten so much better. Bernie was better than the media made him out to be. He was deeply anti-racist. At first, in his 2016 campaign, he did play down those things. He did take what he imagined to be kind of left populist position. But then by the 2020 campaign, he surrounded himself with folks who actually saw the relationship between fighting state violence and fighting for universal healthcare. Now, one thing I should just add real quickly is that one thing that the left in the United States all have in common is that, the mainstream left, is that they love the 1930s New Deal era, so much of the reforms that have become dominant in a kind of, in the kind of Keynesian world of the United States are things like Social Security, Medicare, not Medicare, but Social Security, unemployment insurance, robust welfare state. But the thing that they forget is that the welfare state that emerged in the New Deal in the 1930s was only possible through disenfranchisement. So it was the Southern Democrats who supported the New Deal, and they were elected over and over again because Black people didn't have the right to vote, but they made a deal. The New Deal was set up so that agricultural workers were never protected. Domestic workers were never protected. There was always a wage differential between Black relief workers and white relief workers and Latinx relief workers. In other words, the racial inequalities were baked into the New Deal, which are with us to this day. And they were only baked in because Black people couldn't vote. and Roosevelt went for it. He said, that's bad, but if you'll vote for me, then I'll let you all do what you want to do in the South. Sure. And that's how they got the New Deal. So there's a lot of contradictions.
That sounds a bit similar with the Indian left's fascination for Nehruvian socialism, the Nehruvian era and Nehruvian secularism. And then this the entire Ram temple, you might have heard a little bit in the US about this, the temple, big temple thing, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement and the thing to build the Ram temple.
Wow.
Eventually it's a Congress government, Nehru belonged to the Congress. And Rajiv Gandhi, one of the, what is Rajiv Gandhi? The grandson or something of Nehru. He opens the gates, which allows the Hindu devotees to enter that the precinct of the disputed what is actually a mosque, and it was the Congress doing a kind of a Hindu populism, even though that's what we blame the BJP for doing. So somebody said rightly, I think it is Arundhati Roy or someone saying that the Congress, the BJP does by day what the Congress does by the BJP does in the day what the Congress does in the night. Right. That's the kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's so important because there's the idea that somehow you can manufacture a kind of populism that's free of all the forms of exclusion, because populism kind of presumes it presumes inclusion, but oftentimes it produces forms of exclusion through, and that's a way of building a kind of solidarity, as opposed to being able to step outside of the demand and into other people's needs and demands. And that's a tricky thing.
Yeah. Let's hear others. I see Poroma has written something. What is that, Poroma? Maybe you can tell us. I think it's in the chat.
Right-wing ideologues seem to have also mastered the art of spreading ideology by also creating space for collective action that they seem to be extremely materialistic, even though they're talking about metaphysical identities and gods and whatnot. They also have the money to make the community work. Do you think in comparison, the left has become less materialistic, I guess, as far as their actions go? What are the ways of resource mobilization that has come up in us after the BLM, Black Lives Matter, that can be emancipatory and also can sustain a revolution? That's a damn good question. And it hits something on the head, which is, one, in the US left, there's no such thing as a US left. Actually, let me just be honest about that. There are left tendencies, and they're all very much divided, but there's no universal. And of the left tendencies, I wish I could say they become less materialistic. It just depends. Because, if you think of Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives, as a left tendency, there are definitely left formations within the movement for Black lives, long-time left formations coming out of Black labor organizers, Black Marxists, and anarchists. There are anarchists, Black anarchists who've been part of the movement, but there's another segment of BLM that really does represent a kind of petty bourgeois rising wing of the Democratic Party. And so if you've been watching the elections, so many of the resources that elements of the movement for Black lives used centered on supporting the defeat of Trump and supporting the Democratic Party, which is fine, as far as it goes. But there was no real effort, I believe, to try to figure out a strategy in which you can keep the kind of emancipatory politics, the abolitionist politics at the forefront, and basically be in bed with the Democratic Party. So right now, so what happened, in the short version, is that there has been a split. And that split has been between those who are pushing a real abolitionist agenda around police violence, prisons, but also the abolition of all forms of oppression, which includes the dismantling of capitalism itself as a system, which of course you can't really do in one fell swoop. It's about thinking of alternatives, thinking of forms of economy, participatory budgeting, spaces where you could take over municipalities and develop socialist strategies. That's sort of one wing. The other wing is we just go with the Democratic Party. We need economic development. We need trade. The only way to end austerity is to build the American economy. And there are people who believe that, who support that. So what we're looking at right now is not just the beginnings, but we're in the middle of a split, of a fight. And a lot of this has to do with resources, So hopefully that answers the question. I wish I could be more optimistic about it, but I do know that we've made a huge leap in the United States around actually being able to talk publicly about the damage that capitalism does, about some alternative. For years, no one was talking about socialism. It just had dropped off. But the democratic socialists have brought it up. Some of the other progressives and leftists have brought it up.
You mean to say people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez? Those are the most socialist-minded.
She's definitely one of the best of the elected officials. She's the best, and she's keeping these other issues about social justice and inequality at the forefront. But she's a product of DSA. The Democratic Socialists of America, which made which resurrected itself, came back and they began running candidates and training people to run for office. The thing about the DSA, though, is that they are also undergoing a split, where one side, like I was not to repeat myself, but one side says, we need universal movements and universal slogans, and we need to sort of move away from anti-racism. Whereas others are like, no, this is fundamental to us. So there's a big split in the movement around this. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I know that one thing I didn't mention is the Afro-Pessimist Wing. And this is, and some of you, I'm sure, familiar with this. So Afro-pessimism is, in my opinion, one of the most dangerous tendencies that we're facing right now not just in the US, but in South Africa and elsewhere. And what Afro-pessimism basically says is that the world could be divided in two categories. There's Black and everyone else. So everyone in the world is anti-Black. And then Blackness becomes the sort of, the invention of Blackness and anti-Blackness is the creation of the modern world. And so based on that argument, it means that there's no class differentiation within Black communities. And so therefore, every Black person, including Black people who have run Fortune 500 companies and signed the documents that put us in jail for longer, that they occupy the position of the slave against anti-Black. And who's anti-Black? Anti-Black people are those who are in cages right now waiting deportation to Central America. They're anti-Black. Anti-Black is all people of India, all people of Brazil who are not Black, all people of Europe. They're all anti-Black. This is the argument of
Chinese, yeah.
All Chinese, yeah. I mean, this is the argument of Afro-pessimism. And so it is an evasion of class. It's a destruction of class. It is a war against class, which justifies Black elites being both oppressed and claiming to be intellectual leaders. So I'm waging war on that side, which I think of as a right-wing term, but no one, I mean, it has basically seized the imagination of a lot of activists on the ground.
So Robin, you mentioned Afro-pessimism. I encountered this term, social death of the Black subject.
Mm-hmm.
Is this phrase a quintessentially Afro-pessimist term, the social death of the Black subject, or is it something that they are using it? You know?
It's something they are using. It originated, at least in the discourse, with a scholar named Orlando Patterson, who's actually pretty conservative, but he was, at the time, he wasn't that conservative. So Orlando Patterson wrote a book on the sociology of slavery, essentially. And by social death, he was saying that to be stripped of one's culture leaves you nothing but blankness, and that is social death. Cedric Robinson, of course, argues that they might be stripped from the terrain in which that culture emerged, but they took the culture with them and carried it. They carried it in the swamps, they carried it in the hills, they carried it on the plantations. So Cedric rejects the notion of social death because he says, they continue to regenerate social life through sociality, through relationships with one another, through worship, through memory, through song, through experience, and that sort of thing. So what the Afro-pessimists did was they took the idea of social death and then just like put it on steroids so that, Black people are all kind of, suffering from a form of social death, and they end up being blanks. And so the issue of culture and regeneration, all that is off the table. And I swear, I'm not making this up, but a lot of the Afro-pessimists, not all of them, think that if you talk about resistance, if you talk about resilience, if you talk about fight back, and any kind of organizing, that's called struggle porn.
Oh.
Struggle porn. I wish I could make that up. So in other words, it's like it becomes pornographic to talk about struggle. Like that's somehow absurd because in the position of the ultimate slave, there is no space for struggle. So the only solution, the only Afro-pessimist solution is the destruction of the world as we know it and to begin again, And so there's no critique of capitalism, no critique of all the things that really reproduce our subordination in our struggle, all that. And there's no acknowledgement that struggle makes a difference.
That's like getting into an abyss, like just get deep into an abyss, or kind of a void.
Right, exactly. And
yeah,
and you know, people, they get mad at me because there's some Afro-pessimists who are more sophisticated, so they hate when I talk bad about them. You know, they get very upset about that. And you know, I think that we just haven't come to terms with the political implications of this argument. You know, no matter how subtle it can be, it still has huge political implications for our ability to build movements. You know, because Black Marxism was never about, it's not a nationalist text. You know, he may have some sympathies for understanding why nationalism exists, but Cedric was a globalist in the sense of internationalist. He just believed that, just like Césaire says in his letter of resignation in 1956 of the French Communist Party, he says, look, I'm all for global international struggle, but we shouldn't be placed second, or be the victims of that, or be told that we have to sacrifice for other people's victories. We've got to be able to develop a form of Marxism, a form of revolutionary thought that could actually incorporate the whole, you know, the whole, to understand all forms of oppression and how to dismantle them and how they're interrelated. Oh, and I see another question, consumerism in the USA, and how young Black men and women partake in class struggle to assert their identity. How does Black Marxism engage with the cultural identity of young Black communities, which has been appropriated by consumerism? How does Black Marxism engage with the music industry? Well, in the last question, Black Marxism doesn't engage at all with the music industry. We can talk about it. I mean the book, and then we just make sure that there are some Black Marxists who probably engage with the music industry. But in terms of the larger question of consumerism, this is so true. You know, it's easy to appropriate cultural artifacts, forms of expressive identity, expressive culture, and then resold to the same people. But I think it's even deeper than that. I think that there's a way in which consumer culture among some Black youth or Black segments of the Black community have become so pervasive that this is one of the reasons why there was some Black male support for Donald Trump. So it's not just consumerism, but it is an embrace of the culture of capitalism as the common sense, you know, as the best way forward. And that's something that we're really struggling with. You know, if you listen to a lot of hip hop, you know, especially from the early 2000s, they loved Trump. Trump was a hero, except for the group called the Crew, they hated Trump, but everyone else, they just thought Trump was like the person they wanted to be. Rich, you know, misogynist, owner of a lot of property. So there's an element of hip hop culture that, you know, if they want to appropriate that, they can have it. But, you know, there's an element of hip hop culture that is in some ways swallows the market logics of neoliberalism.